thanks very much for those that have made it. And I'm just confirming that we're not expecting people to be calling in from virtually. So, because if they are, they're not here. Is it live streaming? Yeah. It is. Okay. For anyone else that's out there in the public, welcome to this update on the 3 water reforms. I'm not going to say too much. I see Siobhan is going to lead us through this. I see Dougal from Wellington Water also, see exactly. We can. Anyway, I'll leave it with you, Siobhan. Thanks very much. If you want to take questions, we can. Will it be easy to do it right at the end, or should we do it at there's certain sections that we should break for?
Just go as you go.
Okay,
it'll be fine.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. Let me know, folks. Thanks, Siobhan.
Right. Thank you. So, yes, we have Dougal List here from Scott Consulting. So Dougal has been chairing a working group made up of regional territorial authorities, so we're all members of that. And he's been doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of staying on top of what's going on with 3 Waters reform. So at the end of October, the government announced it was mandating the reform, which essentially creates 4 entities from all of the councils and collects and basically gathers all of the water infrastructure and creating these entities to look after and manage those assets. So there's another package, I think, coming out next week from DIA. This update is really a brief overview of where we are now. There will be a submission on the economic regulation piece coming to council next week. So you'll see that over the next couple of days as well. So Dougal's been leading that piece of work as well. So there's lots going on in this space, and I'll hand over to him to take you through it.
Thanks, Siobhan, and through you, Mr. Chair. So, kia ora koutou. Thanks for the chance to come along and give you a bit of an update on what's happening in the 3 Waters space. I liken the reforms at the moment to a broad and deep river where on the surface it looks a little placid, but beneath there are logs, there are crocodiles, there are lots of currents running beneath. So it's in quite a complicated space, and there is actually quite a lot going on, but it's not always obvious some of that happening at the moment. So what we're going to run through today is a bit of an overview about the government announcements, which were made on the 27th of October, the opportunities that we're focused on to influence the reforms going forward, and next steps around the process. And very happy to take questions as we go through. So just in terms of the government announcements and decisions, so as Siobhan's mentioned, on the 27th of October, the government made a series of announcements with respect to 3 Waters reforms, and this really centred around a 5th cabinet paper, which was quite a key paper in terms of the series of decisions that they've made on 3 Waters. The paper really focused on this decision on mandated change. So the government has made the decision to legislate to water reforms, and that's obviously a bit of a change in policy direction from previous discussions where there was going to be the opt-in, opt-out provision. So the intent is that it will proceed forward on a legislated all-in basis, which means councils won't actually have to make a decision about whether you choose to opt in and out. It will be a legislative change which mandates that you'd be part of those reforms. And that's got quite a significant bearing in terms of engagement and consultation processes moving forward as well, which we'll come on to. The structure of the reforms remained largely unchanged, so no major changes there in terms of what the government was proposing. 4 water service entities with the boundaries largely unchanged, and that includes the Takiwā boundary at the top of Titaihu, at the top of the South Island, with that aligning to Ngāi Tahu's Takiwā. But a bit of a give there for the councils at the top of the South Island, allowing that those communities that are part of Marlborough and Tasman could be serviced by Entity C. Those same protections against privatisation, competency-based boards, partnership with mana whenua, balance sheet separation and economic regulation. So all those kind of key planks or key bottom lines from the government still there, which mean that water assets and debt get transferred from councils to the new water services entities. And that the water services entities would take over responsibility from 1st of July 2024. So we were on the clock now in terms of that transition process. And the $2 billion better off and $500 million no worse off funding remain on the table, and so it's obviously quite a key component for Wellington City as well there. The changes would be enacted through 2 rounds of legislation, and we're expecting the first bill imminently, given Parliament doesn't sit for many more days this side of Christmas, so looking forward to seeing that first bill. Some of the responses to the feedback through the 8-week process by government, firstly they've established these 3 working groups. The most important is this Governance and Local Voice working group, which has met once for the first time, meets again this Friday and again Friday week, represented from our entity area by Mayor Campbell Barry from Lower Hutt, Mayor Rachel Rees from Nelson, and Mayor Lynn Patterson from Masterton. And they're really focused on the key issues that councils have raised around how do we ensure local voice, how do we ensure accountability, how do we ensure the right kind of governance model for these entities. So that has representatives from all the entity areas and also mana whenua representatives. They've got a very challenging process. It's being chaired by Doug Martin, and so there's a lot of interest in how that proceeds, and the transparency and visibility of that process for local government is really important. There's also an intent to establish 2 other more technical working groups, one to make sure that the water reforms are aligned with RMA reforms, and also one to consider some of the complex issues around rural and community water schemes which were raised by a range of councils around the country. Those 2 working groups haven't been established as yet. In terms of public consultation, the Cabinet paper signalled a clear intent to work with local government on a national public participation into the process. However, we're still really waiting on details and implications for that. The primary opportunity really is going to be through the Select Committee process. I'll come on to that in a second. In terms of key responses to the feedback, there has been some criticism from councils that they haven't had answers to the letters, so the letters each council put on the 8-week process, there hasn't been those direct responses to those. Some of the key issues have been summarised in feedback through the Cabinet papers and also a summary document, but the key response is really the establishment of those 3 working groups, the acknowledgement of the need to align with RMA reforms better, and also through the Water Services Act there's been some more transition provisions put in there, particularly for community-based schemes and allowance for treatment of water other than chlorination, which has been a big issue for councils like Napier and Christchurch. In terms of the timeline, we're still dealing with a pretty high-level timeline, as you can see from this slide. In terms of that top line there, Cabinet decisions on the reform pathway and the establishment of the reform working groups. As you can see through the purple boxes, the intent is that that working group on governance will have the opportunity to have some bearing on the Water Services Bill as that passes through Select Committee process and into legislation. We're also seeing the release of the MB consultation document on economic regulation is something else that came out on the same date, and also we're expecting further announcements around the National Transition Unit. MB have actually had a couple of key personnel changes there. Some of you will know Alan Pragnell has moved on from DIA to MOT, so they've lost quite a significant lead in terms of that role, and they're currently recruiting for both his position and also the National Director of Transition. So both those positions are being recruited to at the moment. And one thing we've strongly flagged with DIA is those positions have a lot of interest to local government. We need to make sure that they understand local government and what your interests, your communities. So trying to help DIA recruit the right kind of people to those roles.
Could I just ask something too? Because wasn't our former Amelia Rees the National Director of Transition? Was that right, Siobhan?
Yes, that is correct. She was acting in that role. I do believe she's finished up in that role now.
Okay, gotcha. Right, thanks.
So there's a number of opportunities still in terms of influencing the design and transition process of the reform. So firstly, in terms of the design through the policy, legislation and structure, the Governance, Representation and Accountability Working Group really provides a really important opportunity to influence that local voice, accountability, representation. So as I say, there's a lot of interest in how that working group proceeds, and they've been tasked with reporting back by March. So we should see more details of that in the next few weeks as they get into their second and third meetings. Those other working groups, really important interfaces there with those other issues as well, and an opportunity to input there too. The key opportunity is obviously the draft legislation and the select committee process. So we are looking forward to seeing the early draft of the bill before Christmas, and we'll obviously be working through analysing that and supporting councils to think about submissions into that. And that really ties in with this engagement process. So you will probably be aware some councils have begun to engage with their communities with respect to the reforms and are seeking feedback. What we are recommending to councils in the Wellington area is to wait until we've got a little bit more clarity on the DIA process and the select committee process, so that we can coordinate a consistent approach across the councils in the Wellington region, so that people across Wellington are getting a consistent story about what is the reforms, what are the timeframes, what are the opportunities for influence, and then seeking feedback to help each council to inform the position that you might take on that select committee process. Auckland's just kicked off an engagement process in the last 24 hours, seeking feedback by Christmas, which means that they're engaging ahead of knowing what's in the legislation, the draft legislation. So that's what we're suggesting in terms of that engagement process. In terms of transition, quite a few opportunities for influencing transition, and really this is critical for the success of the reforms. We're talking about a very major change process which needs active participation and support from councils to make it successful. A lot of councils we're talking, or councils that don't have an organisation like Wellington Water, we're talking about transfer of staff, we're talking about transfer of assets, of debt, processes, and of customer touch points. So there's a really significant transition process to be worked through at the same time that the water sector is grappling with meeting enhanced water regulations and new compliance regime around economic regulation. So there are really significant challenges on the water sector over the next 3 years to transition, to meet those the requirements of the economic regulator of Taumata Arawai, and also maintain that delivery program. And like yourselves, most councils have enhanced their investment in Three Waters over the next 3 years, so there's bigger programs than ever before to deliver. Some of the key opportunities we see there are really engaging with DIA and the National Transition Unit around those key appointments, the appointment of the board chair. I suspect we'll see some announcements on that next week. On the 13th of December, we're expecting some more information. How they undertake the due diligence process for things like staff, debt, assets, the timelines for that, so that works in a way that's feasible for local government, and we understand the resource requirements, and councils have support that you need. So I think what we're going to see with water transition next year is we're moving from a kind of response from the policy framework into more of a structured transition process, which will require some quite dedicated resources within councils to work through those issues and make sure that you can respond and work with DIA on how that works in practice.
Could I just clarify one thing? So you mentioned Taumata Arawai, which I thought is the standards regulator, and then there's the economic regulator, so it's two, yeah, okay. If at some point it might be worthwhile, I don't know if colleagues, maybe just a summary of what the economic regulator does.
Excellent segue. Thank you, Chair. So on the same date that the government announced the direction on Three Waters through the Minister of Local Government, on the same day the Minister of Parker announced feedback, a discussion paper through MB on economic regulation. So those that have worked in the telecom sector or power sector will be quite familiar with economic regulation, but it is new to a lot of people in local government and a lot of people working in other kind of areas. Economic regulation is a really key part of the reforms package. So particularly when you're dealing with large natural monopolies who effectively control the markets, how do you make sure that they provide good customer services? How do you make sure that they're transparent? How do you make sure they're focused on the right things? How do you make sure that there's processes for dispute resolution? So this is what is the role of economic regulation. So MB have released quite a comprehensive policy document. It's 96 pages long. It's a bit of a challenging read, but if you have an interest, I'd encourage you to have a bit of a look through. They've sought feedback on 47 specific points in relation to economic regulation. So we are coordinating feedback on behalf of the Wellington councils, which will come to you next week. I understand. So councils may choose to take their own position off that joint analysis or work together on a joint submission. In terms of key areas that they're considering around economic regulation, there's a number of key elements of how economic regulation tends to work in practice. Firstly, around information disclosure, so there's clear information so consumers can understand the performance of their provider and how it compares with others. Also, control around price and quality, and that's generally through setting a price quality plan, which basically sets out here's how we intend to invest and what that means in terms of price and charges to consumers over the investment period. Economic regulators also tend to set an efficiency challenge to make sure that there's a focus on achieving efficiency and incentivising high quality consumer engagement. And that links to as well setting minimum service levels and consumer dispute resolution systems as well. So the MB document's really quite comprehensive and does step through all of these issues. In terms of the draft that's being pulled together in terms of response for this, what we're suggesting is that there's general support for economic regulation and the need for it as being a really important part of the reforms program. But the MB document perhaps doesn't consider some issues as fully as it should do. So firstly, in terms of alignment and integration with the broader water reforms, economic regulation for water is being driven out of MB, as opposed to the broader designs being driven out of DIA. So we're saying these really need to be thought about together. You know, economic regulation is a very important component, but it needs to work really closely with taumata arawai. It needs to work really closely with the governance structure and the representation structure of the organisation so that all of those components fit together. We also think it potentially needs a really more tailored approach for water, so building off the well understood and functional aspects of regulation in New Zealand, but taking a bit more of a water bespoke model. Water's really big, it's really complicated. The value of water assets are far bigger than any of the telco electricity assets that we have in the country. And also water, it's an essential life-giving aspect, and it delivers broader outcomes. So, you know, we think that there's a real strong need there for a focus not only on economic efficiency, but also how regulation makes sure that there's a balancing with community outcomes and with te mano te wai outcomes as well. So that's that kind of balance, and so that raises the question of, is Commerce Commission the right agency to be the economic regulator, or should there be some changes made to enable Commerce Commission to be the right agency, or should it be a new agency? So we've raised that question. And that links back to as well, the discussion document's a bit light on customer focus. So we've suggested it needs a stronger focus on understanding customers and the types of customers and the types of services that they receive. Residential customers are different from industrial customers, are different from rural customers. So it's really understanding that customer lens in terms of this as well. And in terms of implementation, economic regulation is a really important part of delivering outcomes through water, but that will work really well if the regulator works in a constructive and collaborative manner as the water services entities are established and as they develop in maturity. If it takes a more punitive review and control type approach, we don't think that will be as successful, and that kind of needs to recognise that the water services entities will be going through a transition to establish, transition to mature. So if the economic regulator can work alongside them and help that maturity journey through a collaborative approach while still holding them to task, we think that'll be a more successful way of implementing economic regulation. So say more detail on that coming to you next week. So next steps. So we're really focused not only on that policy framework, but also trying to engage with DIA around transition. There's been we've struggled to get as much information out of DIA as we would like. So we're using a number of avenues there, but we expect with some of those new key appointments that may help with better information. It's very, very hard to plan ahead for water reforms and make sure we're well prepared for it if we don't understand the flight path for implementation. So in the meantime, trying to influence and engage through the working groups, thinking about that engagement and consultation process. We'll be reviewing the content of legislation and thinking about those impacts of transition on local government and Wellington Water as well. But thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome any comments, questions.
Colleagues, questions? Is she online?
Yep. Sean?
There's a temptation, but Councillor Pennant.
Not allowed to do that as chair, Sean. Thanks, Dougal. Appreciate that. I think you're aware that I am a critic of this kind of reform. I don't agree with it. So there's a couple of points. So in terms of the financial liability, if the transfer happens, will we have any responsibility at all?
Sorry, Iona, what's the question?
The question is, will we have any financial costs to cover if the water is transferred over to these new entities?
So the government has a couple of payments to make, better off payments and no worse off payments. So they have stated that councils will be no worse off, but we are working with them to ensure that that is the case.
Sorry, just going forward, so is it that our rates take is not so big because a third of our water, goes towards that?
That's right.
So does that mean in theory, and actually the next question is are you aware where they are up with their purpose of local government work?
Oh, where is that? Barbara may be able to answer that.
Are we drifting outside the scope of the meeting?
No, it's not. It's related because...
Very quickly, it's still in very much the engagement and consultation phase, Iona, and we will be working with the council in the new year to put forward the views of this council, but it's still carrying on at an engagement. I think there's a report due, is it September next year? There's a date next year where a report back from the panel is due, and it's later in the year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what work is being done around the integration between the planning committees under the proposed MBA and this water reform work, so that it's lined up if you're going to do development somewhere, you actually will get some guarantee that the investment will happen?
If I could speak to that, Mr. Chair. So, yeah, that is an issue that's been raised by a number of councils through their submissions. I think the government has responded to that to some degree by establishing this working group around alignment between RMA reform and Three Waters reforms. But you can see a kind of similar type of function or role happening in water and happening under the Spatial Planning Act, where you have regional prioritisation, planning alignment functions. So one of the things we've stressed back to DIA is that thinking needs to be coordinated, because otherwise you potentially got 2 or 3 committees basically doing the same thing, similar people but slightly overlapping roles and a lack of clarity on accountabilities.
So, and what influence, sorry, just last question for now, what influence will councils have over that process? So if you say, we want this kind of city, will we have any influence at all about where the planning and the water goes? What's the latest on that one? Or is that still being worked through?
So if I can respond to that, Mr. Chair. Look, I think it is still being worked through, and that is primarily the focus of the RMA reforms. But in terms of the water reforms, what the government's saying quite clearly is that water should be the taker of the plans, not the director of the plans. So the strategic direction, the intent of where and how cities grow, that kind of thing should be the subject of spatial planning, natural built environment planning, and water should respond to and support that direction, not direct it.
Okay, so just one last question. Is earthquake resilience in there as a key issue to respond to?
There's nothing specific in there at the moment, Iona.
Are you able to make representations that that's important, obviously from infrastructure strength and preparedness for earthquakes?
Yeah, we can make that point. I'm just trying to think through how that would. In reality, we talk about the planning leading the water. That water entity would take demand forecast, but it would also take into account. One would think they'd be set up to take into account the regional differences, or if there are resilience challenges in one specific area, they'd need to build for those.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Councillor Condi.
Thanks. Just coming back to the economic regulator, and I guess one of the biggest challenges in kind of pricing around water is volumetric charging, and whether we might move to volumetric charging, which is, I think, quite different from like electricity or telco issues in the past, where there were already kind of charging models that just rolled over. So can you talk us through, did they unpack that particularly in the document? How did they tackle that? Did it lead you to have some confidence they were on top of that particular issue?
Look, good question. I think we are moving towards a model where volumetric charging will be far more common, but it won't necessarily be required everywhere. So in cities or places where there is a scarcity of water, volumetric charging makes a lot of sense. For some communities, it wouldn't be a good investment to do. So one of the challenges that the water entities will have is take NTDC. They'll be dealing with 22 different ways of charging for water to start off with, 22 different ways of charging for different water services. So firstly, they'll need to understand all those different models and what people are charged for those water services, and then how to come up with a system for fairly allocating price and how that applies as they work towards a more standardised tariff rate across the area, and how quickly that might occur. I'd estimate it's going to take somewhere between 5 to 10 years for the water entities to work through that process of changing the process by which they charge people, bill people, how they price for different services, how they price for different types of services by different customers. So there's a huge amount of work to go through there, and volumetric charging will definitely be a big part of that.
So I guess bringing it back to the Mayoral Task Force recommendations, where there was unanimous agreement around volumetric charging in Wellington City, that there was an agreement that we are in a kind of water scarcity future, and that volumetric charging made sense in that context, but that there was a lot of concern about how you protect the most vulnerable users and make sure that everybody continues to have access to water. So I guess that's kind of my question, is coming back to this economic regulation, is to what extent do we think that the economic regulators are on top of that, understanding those challenges in the water space? Because I think while there's, obviously a lot of people find the idea of volumetric charging quite alarming, and the alarming part is they worry about how that's going to affect the poorest members of our communities.
Through Mr. Chair. So I think that's a detail they haven't got to yet. That would primarily be the responsibility of the water services entity to work through that issue, but what we're flagging certainly at this point is that the economic regulator does need to think about water as an essential life-giving right, and that it does need to think about different types of consumers and how long it might take to work towards fair pricing for consumers. So it's really kind of pushing that angle with the economic regulator of, we need to think about not only efficiency and price but also outcomes for water is really important as well.
And I think you can draw similarities with the electricity industry, where you have the Commerce Commission as the economic regulator, but you have the Electricity Commission looking after the interests of the consumers as well. So there may be some requirement for that type of structure. So energy poverty is a big deal that the Electricity Commission deal with, which would be a similar approach. Whether it can all be done in one place with an economic regulator, I guess that will all be developed in due course.
Okay. Well, I guess I look forward to seeing the submission, but those are the kinds of messages that I would be wanting to send back to them, and saying these are the things that we really want to make sure that this economic regulator is competent to deal with.
I've got a few questions, and I'm most familiar with economic regulation in the gas and electricity space, I suppose, but I did quite a bit of it actually in the UK. And so first question is, usually economic regulation puts a cap on how much profit the entity can make, often is based on either a price cap or a cap based on the capital investment. And these entities are meant to be non-profits. So I'm trying to understand, and I'm going to read this MB document at some point to understand, but can you just help me out as to how that nuance is speculated to be addressed?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good example of the difference. These are not-for-profit organisations. So the organisations, they will basically establish an investment plan over a period, say 5 years, and that will set out all the projects and investment and OPEX that they need to do over that period. And then based on that, they will figure out a price plan for what that costs for consumers. Now, as we understand it, through the operation, they will, as the received then comes in, they will generate some form of profit, but it can't be recognised as a dividend or given to any shareholder. So that would be a profit that they would hold to reinvest, as we understand. And we'd certainly anticipate for a number of years that these entities will be operating at a considerable loss effectively and borrowing considerably. So whilst they might generate some form of profit, which would need to be reinvested, it would be relatively insignificant relative to the amount that they'd be borrowing for the investment. If that helps answer the question.
It does. I think I won't go into any more detail on it because it is quite detailed. So I'm not sure whether this might be for Barbara or Siobhan, but you mentioned the RMA working group, which has got 2 Auckland representatives on it, but no one from Wellington City Council. And we didn't get anyone on the steering group either. So who's selecting the individuals to appear on this, and what's the criteria? And the RMA, I guess, might be outside your...
I think you're better informed than I am, Sean, in terms of the RMA working group, because I haven't heard of the membership on that one as yet. So I'd have to defer to you on that.
Yeah, I thought we got an email the other day.
The selection, it's clearly done by the appropriate part of central government, the appropriate department or ministry. There's been an RMA working group for quite a long time that Wendy Walker has been on as a Wellington region representative, because she has planning in her background professionally.
Okay.
But I'm not sure whether there's a revised one. I understood Wendy might still be part of it.
Wendy is actually, so you're comfortable with that, so that's good. I mean, not to say that I'm not either, but...
Yeah, but Liam and the team are definitely in dialogue with the right people. And actually, we recently received a compliment about the quality of the Wellington City Council submission on work to date.
Yep. Yep. Again. Hey, but I made the regional thing me, but anyway.
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair. As you can see, it's quite a crowded space in terms of working groups, because that's the RMA working group run by MFE. What DIA are proposing is yet another working group, which will be the interface between RMA and water reforms.
Okay.
So again, another issue that we've tried to be quite clear on with government is there's a considerable amount of reform going on across government, and it needs to be very well coordinated and managed because the burden of change on local government is considerable.
Yeah, just one further from me. Going live 1 July 2024, so that's a good period of time. Is that sort of consistent with the sort of time that we saw in Tasmania or other parts of Australia or in Scotland? 3 years?
Well, yes and no. So using Scotland as an example and most other countries that have gone down a water reforms model, they've tended to take a two-jump step. So they've gone from councils to amalgamated entities to bigger amalgamated entities as they've seen that kind of middle step doesn't add as much value as they thought. We're doing the all-in-one big jump. So from 67 to 4 is a very big leap. Auckland Council went a bit faster than that, but that obviously had a lot of push behind it and only had to bring together 5 councils. So I think it does seem like quite a lot of time at this point. I think as we get into reforms, we'll see that that's a really challenging time frame. Not all issues will be resolved by 1 July 2024. Particularly, I think assets will have a long tail on them. I think it's very feasible these entities are up and running and responsible by 1 July 2024, but it may be that councils are still grappling with having to manage ongoing billing past that date. Customer relationships could be a key thing that you need to manage past that date. Certainly you'll still be in the process of clarifying, confirming and transferring all the assets across as well. Some of those will take quite a while to work through, I think.
I'll just note Deputy Mayor Free has a question, Chair.
Thank you, whoever that is. Oh, O'Neill, yeah. Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, thank you. I just came in on the conversation about the economic regulation and talking about parallels between the electricity industry. So, and just thinking about what's happened today with people getting flooding and comment made to me by a customer, a resident, that actually there isn't as much responsiveness to issues as there used to be in the past. So I guess my question about the economic, the economic side of this is, how will a level of service be determined? Will it be consistent across the whole of Area C? And how will that be priced? And and how much thought's going into this? Is there any background thinking on it already, or is it all still to be decided?
An excellent question. So, that drives to the heart of some of the issues that councils have raised of we are concerned that we'll lose the level of service that we have. If there is a problem, who do I call? I currently know the person. I can get on the phone to them. I can get a response within a certain time frame. What will happen in the future? So probably not being able to answer your question directly. These are issues which are certainly at the heart of governance, representation and accountability working group. They're at the heart of how economic regulation and consumer protections will work in relation to the water reforms. They'll also be at the heart of how the entities are designed, how they have, communities like Wairoa and Masterton saying, but, what if there's no local depot? How will we get service? And, but the reality is there will need to be people on the ground who deliver that service who are accountable for their local community. So all of these elements, really do need to work together, and this is why it's a big, complex transition process.
Yeah, because today we've got flooding in Hobart Street to the extent that people can't get out their front doors, and how will that work when it's all controlled much more centrally? And what's to stop people thinking they can still ring their local council, expecting us to be able to do something about it when we quite possibly can't? So and the way it feeds, I suppose, into the economic regulation is you pay for a level of service. And I saw that in the electricity industry. We paid for a level of securities to the extent where we hardly get any outages anymore on our power system. But actually domestic customers are paying dearly for that. So I would like to know that someone is thinking about these things, and that it's and also that they're being transparent, and that we have a chance to feed into that thinking and that process, because we'll be the ones at the end of the phone with upset people when things go wrong.
Noted.
Thank you.
Councillor Foon.
Kia ora, and thank you, Dougal, and apologies for being late. We last week had a presentation at the Regional Climate Change Committee regarding water, and how even though New Zealand is behind, but some of our new developments are now off-grid. And so I guess where the technology's there, and we're in a system where we're using really good quality water to flush down our toilets and what have you. So how is the system taking into account, especially around the economics of it, because if you're not using it because you don't need the system, how is that being taken into account through these processes?
So there's a number of ways in which that can be taken into account. If we start at the top of the tree, so one of the important parts of the reforms will be the government policy statement for water, the three waters. So that will set the overall kind of direction within the context of legislation. And even within legislation, there is an intent that the entities must support growth. So that could be a point in which councils choose to submit that the legislation should ensure that the entities are also very focused on climate change. One of the things we're suggesting is that government policy statement should be jointly developed between local government and government and iwi, to make sure that those broader outcomes are thought about in terms of that overall national direction. Within that national direction, that'll then set the strategic long-term plan, and Wellington Water's just set its first 30-year, strategic plan. So we'd expect the entities would be doing the same thing, so that they have that clarity of what are those big outcomes we're trying to achieve over a 30-year investment period. And then within that, they need to think about what are the investment priorities and how those apply within each local area. Again, what we're trying to suggest through the feedback to government is through the governance structure, councils and communities would have the opportunity to influence in that. Consumers will have the opportunity to influence through the consultation on those processes, and there'd be the attention from the economic regulator to make sure that that was being done in a transparent and fair way, and also from Taumata Arawai that you're meeting, drinking water standards and from regional councils around discharges. So there's a number of touch points which could potentially help to achieve that outcome, and it's really, I say, kind of understanding that system in totality and thinking about how to make sure there's that clear direction from the top, but also those other opportunities to influence are being used as well.
We're really after, not using water in the way that we're using it now. Yeah. I guess, does the system understand that is the direction for the future? Because it seems like we're investing a lot of money in a system that is already becoming outdated.
Yeah. No, look, I think it does reflect that, the amount of investment that's going to be required over the next 30 years is immense. So the tension on making sure that investment is done in a really smart way, that it's targeted to the right places, and that does achieve those broader outcomes, I think is going to be a very important process. So, I think the answer is yes, but it will require ongoing influence through a number of channels.
So I just keep bringing it up every time we go to submit. Okay, thank you.
One more. I've got a couple more, but I'll take one now. So the chair of the steering group was Doug Martin. Don't know if everyone here knows who Doug Martin is, but he's ex-State Services Commission, and I was very impressed with a meeting he chaired a couple of weeks ago. But he did mention, Dougal, and this came up under the Wellington Water Committee, that the four entities is the proposal, but it's not set in stone. And I believe that the steering group was going to have a discussion around where the flexibility might be. So do you know what the outcome of that was?
So yes, it's a good point that there's been a little bit of lack of clarity around the bounds of what is up for discussion. So I think the government's been very clear on its bottom lines in terms of those particular controls around protections from privatisation, co-governance, balance sheet separation. The terms of reference for the working group were silent on 4 entities and the boundaries, but I understand that those are bottom lines from the government as well. We have asked Doug Martin his understanding of that, and what he has said is he's keen to get ideas on the table, even if they don't necessarily align with those bottom lines, in order that good ideas can be surfaced. So I understand the government bottom lines are the government bottom lines, but Doug's keen to run a process of encouraging a range of ideas to see what gems might be in amongst those.
Okay. And so it says here feedback by 20 December. Is that feedback from this council, feedback from Wellington Water, or feedback from everyone to the DIA? Or
so that's for the economic regulation consultation piece to MB.
Okay.
They're seeking that by the 20th of December. So we've got a draft submission circulating with councils currently.
Could I have a look? I might put a submission in myself.
So you'll be getting that pack tomorrow, I believe. So
Okay.
it's for the council meeting on the 15th.
Good. Anyone else, folks? Good. Well, thank you so much. Oh,
Yeah.
Deputy Mayor Free.
Yeah, just wondering again about the stormwater issue. Has the government definitely decided that the stormwater is going to be part of the 3 water reforms? Because again, it occurred to me the flooding that's occurring at the moment in Miramar is a pretty complex issue. It may be one that actually needs to be handled with a multi-pronged approach.
Yes, I understand through the latest cabinet paper, the government is recommitted to 3 waters, not 2.
Okay.
Not 2 waters, 3 waters. They've committed to 3 waters.
I
So
wonder if we should submit on that as a council. I mean, I imagine who's in charge of the submission, by the way?
So
Who's
if I could
leading, holding the pen?
The position to help perhaps with you on that. One of the reasons why Wellington Water deals with 3 waters, and one of the reasons why Wellington councils have tended to support 3 waters, not 2, is that if you don't deal with stormwater as part of an integrated approach to water, it's very difficult to deal with water quality issues. So
Okay.
You're seeing the flooding issue today, and obviously the thing that you'll see in the next few days in the harbour will be the impacts of stormwater being interconnected with the wastewater system.
And
Yeah.
we've already put our submission in. What we are now, I'm not sure if Doug's going to run a formal process asking for councils to throw these ideas up, but he has indicated that he's interested. So I don't think we as a council will be making submissions in a formal sense other than select committee. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Good. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you very much, Dougal. Thanks, Siobhan, and to officers as well. We will convene and talk about this a bit more next week, I guess. But also, we'll see you Thursday as well. Talk about waste and stuff. All right. Cheers.